This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Welcome, listeners. It's Stu here, your host of the Thrive Today podcasts. Just before we jump into this episode of Thrive Perspectives, we have some really big news. We're excited to launch our crowdfunding campaign to build the Thrive Today app, a one-stop platform for daily inspiration, biblical insight, and transformative teaching. This app will bring together everything you love: Thrive podcasts, daily Bible reading guides, teaching video series, and a growing library of meaningful resources designed to deepen your faith journey. But we can't do it without you. To make this vision a reality, we need to raise $30,000. The build won't begin until the full amount is raised, and if we don't reach our target by the end of January 2026, every donation will be refunded in full. So your support is absolutely vital. Will you partner with us? If so, simply visit our website, thrivetoday.tv, click the app crowdfunding link at the top. You can then select your level of support. We'll keep you updated on progress as we seek to raise the funds needed by the end of January 2026. Welcome to Thrive Perspectives, as we continue our series on big ideas that shaped our world. I'm your host, Stu, and today we're diving into the controversial and provocative ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche, who boldly declared, "God is dead," challenging the very foundation of Christian belief. In the late 19th century, as the world embraced the rational and reasoned approach to all things, Nietzsche called for a radical consistency of thought. Without God, there can be no inherent morality, no ultimate meaning, and no divine purpose. He envisioned a humanity that creates new values and meaning, rejecting the moral and spiritual truths that Christianity upholds. In every way, Nietzsche's idea sits in direct contradiction to Christ. Join us as we explore Nietzsche's clash with Christianity, his critique of modernity, and how this still shapes our worldview today. Matt Connell, Thrive Perspectives. We continue our series on big ideas. I think we're episode number 6, I think it is.
I think we're getting some perspective.
Yeah, I think we are. I didn't know there were that many big ideas, but anyway.
If you're still tracking with it, good on you.
Yeah.
Maybe that says something about you, but we're trying to keep it practical, aren't we? I mean, I find this enormously practical, so we will continue to try to make that connection in this episode, absolutely.
Yeah. Totally. And we realize that some of these things, it's like, why do I need to know about, Kant and all these people? But I guess what we're trying to do is paint a bit of a picture about the way we think in our modern age.
Yeah, it's the ideas. It's not the names are slightly beside the point.
It's where these ideas and this way of thinking has come from. And understanding that is a great way for us to understand how we can move away from that way of thinking if we need to.
Yeah, that's right. If you have some form of condition, it helps to understand how you ended up with that.
That's right.
How did you end up with that condition? And understanding that can be part of the solution moving forward. So essentially, we're diagnosing our postmodern condition.
Fantastic. I love it. Dr. Matthew Jacoby, diagnosing our postmodern condition. There's a book in that, I think. Anyway, welcome, listeners. Again, great to have you with us. So, Matt, we're going to be picking up now as we move forward in the thinking, and probably look at a person called Nietzsche, born in Prussia.
Friedrich Nietzsche, yeah. But again, it's the ideas that are all important
But just giving some context, dates, 1844 he was born, died in the 1900s, or
1900.
1900. Not a protege with Darwin.
No,
but definitely an overlap.
There's an overlap, and there's significant influence there.
Yes, totally. Yeah. So we can jump in and have a talk about that, but we're going to be talking about his perspective, and really, because we'd moved in our last episode, we talked a bit about Kierkegaard as we got to the end of it, and Kierkegaard trying to speak into the fact that the world had tried to, in a sense, rationalize God again, and to bring back the sense of mystery. In a sense, Nietzsche is trying to come back and say, well, actually, no, his famous statement, God is dead, and we need to move beyond that.
Yeah, let me make the link, and just a quick reminder. Again, broad brushstrokes. In the last episode, we got up to, as you said, Kierkegaard, or in Danish, it's kind of pronounced Kierkegaard, but Kierkegaard is fine. Right? And that's what I say. And one of the key points that Kierkegaard is making is that what's primary is not reason. For Descartes, we build everything up just by reason.
Yes.
Reason is this basis. But what Kierkegaard is saying is that all our reasoning is based on a base motive. What
presupposition.
a presupposition that we choose, right? So essentially for Kierkegaard, choice, the will is primary, right? Where there's an act of the will. So even in reason, we're willing a certain basis and then reasoning from that. So reason is not a neutral instrument. It's an instrument in the hand of the will. Now, this is already something going back to, and there'll be a lot of ringing back to our first episode, Stu. This is already something that, Augustine was aware of, that, we can philosophize all we want, but there's the matter of the will.
Yeah.
And for Augustine too, that's really primary. And Kierkegaard essentially comes back to this, saying, well, at the very basis, we're making a choice. We choose something. And this essentially is the beginning of what becomes known as existentialism, and this recognition that choice is primary and existentialism becomes more of an atheistic movement in the 20th century. And somewhat that begins with Nietzsche, actually, because this is the link to Nietzsche. So he agrees with this, actually, that the will is primary. We reason from an act of the will. Now, one of the ways in which Nietzsche agrees with Kierkegaard is that for Kierkegaard, the will is not in a neutral state. This is so important, actually, lest we get just lost in the sort of intellectual realm here. This is a philosophical point, but this was one of my most important discoveries about myself as a seeker of God, was recognizing that I'm not starting from a neutral point of view.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to keep making.
That actually, God didn't save me because my heart was was perfectly pure and devoted to him. No, he saved me despite that, right? We get salvation as a gift. And then he deals with the heart, right? And that's progress. Now, one of the things that I had to face, and this for me was, as I said, a really important moment, was actually recognizing how much my heart was actually against God, to put it simply, that there was so much within me that was resistant with God. There was so much within me that was holding on to my own autonomy. It is, we've described it before, and this is the link between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, because what Kierkegaard recognizes is that we think that using reason, that we're seekers of the truth, and he looks at philosophy, all these philosophers like, looks at Hegel, for example, and who's trying to understand all of existence, come up with the truth, discover the truth. This is putting it crudely.
Yes.
And essentially, Kierkegaard is saying, you don't want to know the truth. We have to face the fact that we have an inbuilt resistance to the truth. We're in a process of escapism, right? We're escaping from the truth. We are running away. We're not neutral, right? And we're running away because we're holding on to something. And essentially what we're holding on to is the God complex.
Yes,
we
that's
want
right.
our own independence and autonomy. We want to create our own selves, right? And coming to God means the destruction of that self-created self. And that's the last thing we want. So we naturally, without even knowing this about ourselves, we run away from that. Now, as I said, that for me was a really important discovery, to realize, okay, I'm not neutral. I'm actually running in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
And I need to allow God to subdue that, to, in a sense, subdue my running away. And I need to learn how to turn around and walk the other way and allow God to dismantle my autonomous self bit by bit.
And as he does that, reveal himself more and more to you.
That's right.
That's the point.
So lest we think that everything that we're talking about today is irrelevant, this is enormously important. So Nietzsche also recognizes that. He recognizes this drive for autonomy. This individual is this sense of independence and autonomy, this drive within us, which he referred to as the will to power.
Yes.
Okay, that this is the core of Nietzsche's philosophy. He referred to this as the will to power. Now, this is where there's a fork in the road, because for Kierkegaard, this is the thing that prevents us from knowing the truth. Because we want to be God, so when we can't really know God because we're too busy trying to be God, right? And that Kierkegaard thinks motivates all. That's the key blocker for knowing the truth. Now, Nietzsche agrees with this. When he talks about the will to power, he agrees that that's sort of the key principle in life. And I'll say more about that. But he thinks we need to affirm that. So he says, actually, we need to work with that. And this episode is going to take us back to where we started. Now, in the first episode, we talked about the Christian Revolution and how this Christian Revolution, it essentially challenged, the previous way of thinking, sort of, and I would say, and I've got to summarize this, so I'm going to say sort of a previous way of thinking that was rooted in a sort of warrior ethic, the kind of Homeric sort of hero, the Achilles and the Odysseus and these ancient heroes, these strong individuals that were a law unto themselves. And this hero ethic, and that were revered in ancient societies, the strongest is that. Plato's going to argue against that, but he's not quite going to change the caste system. He's going to just replace that with another kind of caste system. Now, essentially what Nietzsche wants to do is to actually uproot the Christian influence from society. So basically, he looks at society, he says that we've largely rejected God. This is sort of second half of the 19th century. And we've kind of rejected God, but we're not facing that we really have. And I think this is enormously important.
Yes.
Right? We've rejected God, but we're not facing the fact that we're still in a sort of cradle because, he thinks we're still comforted by and we find consolation and we find comfort in the sort of Christian worldview. We essentially hold on to it, but deep down we've kind of rejected it in another sense.
Yeah, so his statement isn't really a theological statement. It's much more about diagnosis about where society was at that time. But we're wanting to hang on to all of this stuff that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, but he does want to uproot. He wants to uproot it. And this is his key thing. I mean, this episode is also important from a kind of cultural development point of view because essentially what he does is that he draws out the implications of the new Darwinist view of the world. Okay, so we haven't mentioned Darwin yet, and this is the episode where we talk about this. So we're not going to talk about evolution as such, more Darwinist philosophy, the idea that things unfold through a process of, natural selection, but
survival of the fittest.
Yeah, but survival of the fittest. And actually, Darwin didn't initially come up with that term. That was coined by a English philosopher called Herbert Spencer, who in turn was influenced by Darwin. And then Darwin subsequently picked up that way of speaking eventually as well.
Darwin wasn't necessarily approaching this either from a sort of an atheistic perspective. I don't know where he stood in terms of that spectrum, but it was just an observation in science and his theory of evolution.
Yeah.
He wasn't necessarily biased towards an atheistic position. It was just his sort of observation and his theory, where I think what Nietzsche then does is point out the obvious conclusion that then follows from the Darwinian.
Yeah, so from Nietzsche's vantage point, he looked back basically at the journey that we've taken. So remember we talked about the new universe in the episode called the New Universe, where we talked about the changing view of the universe as the big machine, and God becomes the one that makes the big machine, a sort of the deist God that's kind of out there. He makes the machine and then he just lets it run, right? Now, essentially, that's a step. Even though Isaac Newton was a Christian, that view of the universe contributed to, in a sense, slightly pushing God further out. You know what I mean? Because suddenly, the universe becomes a big machine, and God's the machine maker, and he's sort of out there somewhere, and he sort of ducks in to fix things, maybe every now and again. But on the whole, it runs by itself. Now, I mean, this is partly Nietzsche's responding to this, partly saying, yeah, right. So we don't really need God, particularly with Darwinism, because Darwinism can explain how the machine made itself.
Yes.
So there were two steps there. So after Newton, the new universe is a big machine, right? That's one step. So we've pushed God outside the machine largely. Now we know that it's not like that, right? Since Einstein and quantum physics, that's actually not. It's way weirder than that. It's way more, if I can put it this way, even somewhat supernatural. I mean, quantum physics is weird. Or quantum field theory. There's a public lecture series from, it's called the Royal Institution, RI, and there's a lecture I encourage listeners, if you're a bit of if you've got an interest in science, watch the one on quantum field theory and it'll spin you out. Anyway, that's just a little side. So we've got these two steps. The universe is a big machine. God's the one that makes the machine. But then Darwin comes along and shows, oh no, but the machine can actually make itself through this kind of algorithm of natural selection, right?
Yeah.
This is the point that Daniel Dennett makes in his book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, right? Now, Nietzsche looks at this and says, excuse me, everyone, we've basically got rid of God, and we haven't quite realized it yet. And there's this famous parable that he tells in one of his books called the parable of the madman, right?
Yeah.
Where it's a parable about a prophet. Well, it's actually a madman that comes into a town, and he's crying out, we've killed God, but we haven't realized it, and he's saying, we've unchained the earth from its orbit, we're plummeting through space. There's no, and he's a madman because he's realized this, and there's no foundation anymore. All of the old things that made sense of life are no longer there. And this is, this is the section where the famous phrase "God is dead" comes from, because this madman cries out in the marketplace, God is dead, and we have killed him. We ourselves are his murderers." And essentially what it means is that we've shut God out. We've created a universe from which God is shut out. Now, amen to that. Absolutely, that is classic human God complex at work there, right?
Well, when I was looking at Nietzsche to start with, I thought, man, this is one evil dude, like reading through a lot of the stuff that he's talking about. But when you actually kind of look at it in that context, you kind of realize it's actually an important piece of thinking that he did there, because he did sort of state the obvious and pointing out that which people were missing in that time is that when you look at the advance of thinking and the different ideas, and then into the work that Darwin did and so on, people were still hanging on to this idea of God as if we could keep all those ideas and not confront the reality that the natural consequence of all of this then is to kind of arrive at, as Nietzsche sort of points out, we've essentially killed God, and we just have to accept that as the reality, and we need something to replace the idea of God. Although it was interesting too, like Nietzsche also seemed to speak highly of Christianity in the lead up to that as a necessary tool that underpinned modern science, which was something I was sort of reading about. He recognized it as a necessary, because a lot of that original thinking was coming from that, a lot of the Christian thinking. So it was necessary to actually get us to a point to realize that we don't need it anymore. But it was necessary to get us there. And so now we need to sort of turn the lights on, realize that God isn't there, and therefore we need to replace it with something else.
Yeah, but I think it's not just about replacing God so much, if I can just say that. I think it was more that it just removed all of the transcendent meaning of life, values. It's like, so what's the point of it all? Darwinism, I think, was sort of saying, well, there is no point, it's just survival of the fittest and we'll just keep evolving. And he was trying to say, well, nah, actually the will to power,
but he was trying to replace it too, though, with something like he was. I mean,
let me get onto that. Let me get onto that, because essentially he's saying, well, if that's true, right? If there is no God, then let's be consistent with that.
Yeah.
And this is what I appreciate. This is what I appreciate about Nietzsche, because he is consistent. And philosophers subsequently that are consistently influenced by Nietzsche, I appreciate their consistency. Because they say, well, we can't get rid of this and still hold on to fragments of it. We have to get rid of it. We have to uproot the whole thing.
Otherwise, we're just fooling ourselves.
Like we have to build on a new foundation now, right? Because our whole civilization is based on this Judeo-Christian basis. Now, for Nietzsche says, so if we get rid of that, if we get rid of a transcendent sort of standard, then all there is this. And how does this exist? How does this come about? How did we get here? Now, again, he looks to Darwin. Well, we got here through natural selection. And he wants to go further than that. He leans more into the survival of the fittest thing, right?
Yep.
In other words, it's by allowing the will to power to have expression, because he thinks this will to power is actually a principle of life that causes life to progress, right? It's the strong overcoming the weak, and that's how the species progresses. So he says, now, if that's all there is, right, then we have done a terrible, terrible thing since Moses and Jesus and all of this stuff about look after the weak. He thinks, and again, starting with the law of Moses, and he puts the blame right back on the biblical faith, right, starting from Moses. Okay. And he says, basically what we've done is that we have demonized the will to power. We've called it sin.
Yes.
Now, we do call it sin. I said that actually is, essentially sin is autonomy, right? It's this will to power. But he's saying if there is no God, and let's be consistent, then the will to power is actually, we should affirm this, not deny it, right? Which means that the prevalence of the strong over the weak actually is something that's really important for the progression of the species. Now, he thinks that what has happened since the Judeo-Christian, certainly during the Christian Revolution mainly, he looks back at that and he says, you know what's happened since then is that we've stopped evolving as a species. We need to dig all that up because that's essentially repressing our development as a species, because we've said about strong individuals who essentially walk over the weak. Because we've said this is bad and you know, we've glorified humility and this blessed are the meek. You know, Nietzsche says, you've heard it said, blessed are the meek, but I say to you, that which is falling should also be pushed. So he wants to turn all these values upside down and let's be consistent with this, because we need to actually celebrate strength and not, you know, and just stop. So in a sense, he has a new sort of messianism, which essentially he proclaims the coming of what he calls the Übermensch. You know, that when we get rid of all of this, human beings will start to develop again, and one day the Übermensch will come. And he says one day the Übermensch will look at us as we look at the apes. You know, but we need to allow for this process of the strong overcoming the weak.
Yeah. But he placed a lot of value in this sense of gaining control and power, which is what he sort of added to Darwin, because I felt like he was kind of quite critical of Darwin, because it's as if natural selection is just this kind of it just happens and there wasn't really any reason for why it should continue. Or sure, we evolve and so on, but so what? And I think he was trying to answer the so what, that the actual sense of value in this is that value is actually created, not even, he talked about good versus bad rather than good versus evil. So he sort of
there is no good and evil.
There is no good and evil. And said there was good and bad. So good is what's good for
life, progression of life.
Progression of life, and bad is what is bad for progression of life, and tried to redefine it in those terms, which then meant what is good for progression of life is the strongest.
Okay, let me read a quote.
Superior.
Let me read a couple of quotes. So, first quote is from his book Beyond Good and Evil. He says, "Life itself is essentially approbation, injury, overpowering of the strange and weaker, suppression, severity, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and at the least and mildest, exploitation. Exploitation does not pertain to a corrupt or imperfect or primitive society. It pertains to the essence of the living thing as a fundamental organic function. It is a consequence of the intrinsic will to power, which is precisely the will of life." The next quote is from a book called The Gay Science, a gay, like the happy science, the Fröhliche Wissenschaft in German, in case you're wondering. He says this, "What is life?" he says. "What is life? That is continually shedding something that wants to die. Life, that is being cruel and inexorable against everything about us that is growing old and weak, and not only about us. Life, that is then being without reverence for those who are dying, who are wretched, who are ancient, constantly being a murderer, and yet old Moses said, 'Thou shalt not kill.'"
So completely setting himself up in the most starkest contrast of what Christian values and worldview is.
Yeah.
Complete opposite.
Yes, essentially what he does then is what generally atheists do, is that they go back through history and they then go and look for an account of how then did we end up with religion, right? Yep. Sometimes, and I've said this before, sometimes their explanations for how religion came about are sometimes referred to as sort of proof for the fact that there is no God, but those explanations are based on atheism. Atheism isn't the conclusion of those origin of religion arguments.
That's why you got to recognize the foundation.
Those the naturalistic origin of religion accounts are based on the presupposition of atheism, right? Because if there is a God, then it's very evident where this spiritual impetus within us comes from. And if there is a God from whom we have fallen away and rebelled, then you can totally see why, religion becomes a sort of garbled thing. And so anyway, so he comes up with his own kind of origin of religion argument based on this. And basically the story that he tells, and it's just a story that he tells based on his presupposition, is that this was how the weak masses, and he talks about the herd, the weak masses, they resented the strong individuals that were oppressing them. And so they invented God, who was above the weak masses and above the strong, and who is favorable towards the weak, right? So they basically flip the script so that there is a God. And he's talking about the law of Moses, because the law of Moses is so oriented towards the poor and the weak and making sure you look after the weakest members. And it's also oriented towards, as we've seen before in our deeper podcast, but I think also we looked at this when we talked about the Christian Revolution, is that the law of Moses basically abolishes caste systems. So we saw that, all these ancient societies are based on caste systems, and that, the law of Moses basically, abolishes that, wants to, basically make everyone equal. Now, he thinks this is the worst idea, right? Because people aren't equal, right? Some are stronger than others, right? And actually, it's the strong that need to prevail.
Yeah.
Right. In a kind of survival of the fittest framework, the strong need to prevail, right? And the weak need to die away. But the story that he tells is that, the weak, basically gain power over the strong by inventing a God, who condemns the strong, who condemns pride, and who then instills, conscience within, that then suppresses this conscience, sees as a social construct, which then suppresses the will to power. And, this has an enormous influence. I mean, Freud, for example, agreed with that. He agreed that conscience is a social construct that people have invented, society's invented to stop these kind of primal human elements, that need and cry out for expression, right?
Well, Nietzsche said something about conscience too, because he said it's almost like you inflict pain on those that are weaker, like showing compassion and pity aren't really helpful things, because really it'd be better for the weaker to just die off, and there's no point in trying to lift them up and help them, because it's not helpful in the overall progression. So in doing so, you actually cause pain. In conscience is just the reflection of that pain back onto you. Like it's a kind of, you feel the infliction of pain, which is a really interesting idea.
So this is still in currency, this idea that this conscience, the idea of, conscience as a social construct it's still very much with us, right? So this is the story he tells. Let me read another quote from Nietzsche. This is from On the Genealogy of Morals. He says that lambs dislike great birds of prey does not seem strange, only it gives no ground for reproaching these birds of prey for bearing off little lambs. And if lambs say among themselves, these birds of prey are evil, and whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, would he not be good? Right, this is what they're doing, right? They're resentful of those who prey on them. But again, this is it's actually important that that the strong are the strong. So he goes on to say, this is a quote from Thus Spake Zarathustra. He says, man is evil. All the wisest men have told me to comfort me. Ah, if only it be true today, for evil is man's best strength. Man must grow better and more evil. Thus do I teach. I rejoice in great sin as my great consolation.
Yeah. Is anyone getting Nazi vibes here?
Well, okay. It was, taken up by the Nazis. However, there's a lot about Nazism, because I need to be fair to Nietzsche, and you might not feel it's necessary to be fair to Nietzsche, but he's actually not into nationalism, because that's just mass movement.
Yeah.
What it does, it actually disguises the individual. The individual becomes like the little fish in a swarm of fish, those big swarms of fish, we hide in. Yeah. That's just the herd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he thinks
community should be distrusted.
Yeah, basically. He thinks this nationalism, these forms of nationalism are just more herd trying to doing its thing, and he's not necessarily, I mean, whether he's racist is another thing, and not necessarily. I think he for example, I think he admired the Jews for a lot. I think he actually admires their strength and their the evidence of that. So he wasn't anti-Semitic as such.
It wasn't breaking it along racial lines. It's even worse than racism in a way. Like he wasn't just saying this particular race is superior to another race. He was just saying it's at an individual level. Some humans are more superior than others, and they're the ones that should be allowed to survive.
Mind you, like I can see where they got it from because, and I can't remember where this passage is from, but he has these passages where he talks about these blonde beasts roaming the earth and killing off the weak. And it's like, yep, that sounds like the sort of Aryan.
But you can also weaponize what maybe Nietzsche didn't mean to say at a racial level, but then you can take that ideology and weaponize it and say, well, actually, there are superior races, and there is one race. There are races that are superior to other races, so therefore you kind of sort of militarize a movement against a whole race of people.
Yeah, I think there were elements of Nazism that were actually consistent with the Nietzschean perspective. The positive eugenics movement.
Yeah.
The killing off of those who are intellectually and mentally disabled. Yeah. Like all of that sort of stuff was based on based in these.
So they would have looked to Nietzsche as almost a forerunner or a prophet, if you like, of that ideology.
So just for me, in simple terms, because I'm a relatively simple person, it seems to me that Nietzsche's approach was we're going to go at the speed. We're going to go at the speed of the best of us, not at the speed of the least of us.
Yeah,
we're not going to slow down to make sure we bring as many with us.
Yeah,
we're going to go as fast as possible and leave the slow ones behind. Yeah. And that's actually how we ensure our survival, but also we progress.
It's not even about. Was it about survival? He was more focused on. So Darwin was seems more focused on survival, but Nietzsche was saying, no, it's got to be more than that. It's got to be more about
it was more
actually about value.
Progressing.
We need to get better, like this. What's the word? The
Uberman.
Super. He
Superman,
envisaged like a kind of a Superman. That's where we're going. Like there's a destination that we need to get to. It's not just we just sort of meander there through natural selection.
And to do that, he was saying we have to revalue all values. We can't base our values on anything that's come before. We need to reset those values now. And those statements kind of.
And value is that.
Yes.
That the only thing that's of any value really is that progression towards that kind of Superman that he envisaged.
Yeah. As I said before, he's being consistent, I think. If we reject God, then we have to reject the Judeo-Christian system of values. And if you reject the Judeo-Christian values, well, you're going back to values that are based purely on the natural world as it actually is and actually unfolds. And it's a place of survival of the fittest. It's dog-eat-dog world. That's the way it's got to work. So let's just affirm that. We can't be talking about any meaning beyond that, any sort of higher form of, transcendent values. No, this is all that there is, and we're just going to make the best of this. And I mean, it's interesting that he does even this value to keep progressing and keep sort of evolving. I mean, that is somewhat of a transcendent value because who says that should be the case? But it's interesting that a philosopher called Michael Ruse, who's an atheist, attempts to come up with an argument for how life can be meaningful without God. Now, it's a contemporary Nietzschean philosopher. There's a South African philosopher called David Benatar, who argues that all of this talk about meaning is completely inconsistent. So he's doing the same thing as Nietzsche. We need to get rid of life is not meaningful, right? Yeah. In fact, David Benatar takes this in another direction because he thinks that he's what's called an antinatalist, which means he believes that bringing forth life is necessarily bringing harm, right? Because life is cruel, it's meaningless,
right.
It's an endless escape from pain. We never really ever feel satisfied. And so, for David Benatar, bringing life forth is a great harm and morally wrong. I mean, it's interesting that he still has some kind of sort of moral framework even in that. But he's kind of influenced by Nietzsche. He doesn't completely pick up on that. But it's interesting. There's a quote from Michael Ruse, and this is in a book called A Meaning to Life. And listen to this. Michael Ruse says, meaning for the evolutionist is found. And by evolution, I mean evolutionary philosophy.
Yeah. Yes.
Meaning for the evolutionist is found in the upward rise of the history of life, monad to man. We humans are in some objective sense the winners. the top of the tree, of more value than other organisms. This is a function of many things, but our minds, our consciousness, our intelligence are all important factors. We are in some sense more complex than other organisms. This complexity in some way plays itself out by making us thinking beings with an ability to understand our world and with our own powers of choice, of deciding between good and evil. Interesting, slight inconsistency there, I would say. But anyway, this readily translates into prescriptions. In the biological world, we are to keep up the evolutionary process, at least not letting it decline and perhaps helping it ever upward. In the social realm, for remember that biological process is a child of cultural progress, we are to make for a better society for one and for all. I should say that this notion of what improves us as people and what does evolve us as people, the Nietzschean account of the individual, the strong individual, is not necessarily consistent. There's an argument has been made that the social individual is more highly evolved, and for us to be social means to cooperate, and moral systems are rules of cooperation, right? So there's that. As well. Yeah. But I think the problem with this is that, he's looking for meaning and he's saying, we need to continually evolve and get better. Again, like, why?
Yeah.
I mean, but so David Benatar looks at this and says, no, you cannot, you're trying to, and this is the Nietzschean critique of this. It's like, no, you're still trying to retrieve notions of transcendent meaning, that there is an ultimate meaning to life. And you can't have that. There's nothing ultimate. If there's no God, there is no ultimate transcendent perspective. There is no ultimate transcendent meaning.
Was Nietzsche, though, even saying that there was an ultimate? It's more that this is the world. This is the only world we know of. It's the one that we're in. So we just make the best of what it is. And the best way to get meaning out of the here and now is this particular worldview that he was advocating. So he wasn't necessarily making out to be some sort of transcendent or ultimate truth. It's just that's all we've got at the moment. Because Nietzsche also didn't believe in truth or that we can know truth. We
make our own truth.
Because one of his quotes was that truth is the errors that we haven't refuted yet, and so it's like it's just the things that we haven't sort of figured out, that what we think is true is just we haven't quite figured out why it's not true yet. It's kind of, and so he didn't really think there was any kind of objective truth. It's just the here and now. This is all we've got.
Well, there's no transcendent standard, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, what is true, what is ultimately real is this here and now. So essentially the big theme here for Nietzsche, he thinks we need to have the courage to face this. In a way, this call to face the implications of what we choose, of what deep down we choose. I think there's a consistency here, and Nietzsche's saying we need to have the courage to actually, if we're going to reject that, then reject it. Don't still hold on to fragments of it.
Yeah. That's the power of this. You can read this and go, oh, that's terrible, what he's saying, and then just disregard it. But it is a really important piece of work. And I think this is why it's held up so highly. It's because it is presenting the consequence of buying into.
That's right.
Well, we don't do enough of that today. We just absorb these other worldviews. Without
and let them sit parallel when they don't even work together.
And we don't really question them or think about them, and this is why thinkers like Nietzsche obviously are so important, because they do this thinking that most of us aren't really capable of doing or articulating as well as what he can. So I think it's really important to capture that and be able to serve it up to us and go, this is what we've got.
This is what we've got. And it makes it clear. One of the things I appreciate, I studied Nietzsche at a graduate level and I wrote a minor thesis on Nietzsche and read all of his books. And one of the things I appreciated was that consistency, that he polarized the issues. It's like, what do you want? Is this what you want? Because, and let me bring this back to a practical level. Like, I feel like a lot of listeners are probably sitting there thinking, oh man, that's awful. How could anyone believe such things? No, the thing is, I'm going to put this in a confronting way. We actually practice these values.
Yes.
Those moments where you're trying to be noticed more than other people, where you're trying to be better than other people, where you're willing to climb the ladder at the expense of other people. It's this constant drive for comparison. I need to be better. I need to be higher than that person. I need to be ahead of that person. The sense of entitlement that I deserve more than this.
We're trying to gain control of power.
It's the will to power, right? You know, I think what Nietzsche does is that he polarizes the issue and he diagnoses something. He says this is at work in all of us, right? We're just fooling ourselves thinking that it isn't. And again...
Yeah, we've talked about, and if you go back through most of the episodes of what we talked about, this comes up like it's the human predicament is the number one thing at the heart of all sin and our desire for autonomy from God and all the stuff that, you know, goes into our separation from God. Nietzsche's correctly diagnosing the same problem as the Christian. This is the other thing too, though, with Nietzsche, that it's that diametric opposition to Christianity. You can almost look at Nietzsche and then see the exact opposite in the Christian worldview. So that need to control for power, Nietzsche provides an explanation for it. He sees it. He sees it. So, and then he has to provide a philosophy or a worldview around it. And so we can look at Nietzsche's view of that, or we can look at the Christian worldview of that. But that need for control power is it's central to both worldviews. They're just looking at two different sides of it and coming up with a completely different reason. It's the same with like the superiority of humanity. We feel like we are superior to other life forms. We're being put at the top of the tree in the natural order of creation. So from the Christian worldview, we look at that and go, it's because we're made in the image of God. And we've been placed there by God. And that's Nietzsche recognizes that we are at the top of the creative pool, but his explanation of it is tied into, you know, the evolutionary aspect of it, driving us forward to become, and our obligation to become superior. So instead of rejecting that kind of need to control and be superior, we got to grab hold of it and go the other way. It's a complete opposite to Christianity. Like
it is the complete opposite.
Everything. This is what I found quite powerful about his work, is I can look at it and see exactly the opposite principle. It's like a opposite reflection of everything in the Christian worldview, but reflected into the opposite of worldview of what happens when you switch off the Christian worldview. You're left with that worldview.
And if you look at what Christ taught and put those two, they're diametrically opposed.
And he calls himself the Antichrist. And he sees himself
his last book was called The Antichrist,
You know, he's obviously using that term as a way to sort of clickbait sort of thing.
He is very provocative. I mean, everything that I've read to you is, you know, he puts things in ways that are very provocative. So there's a literary element to everything.
But I think
everything that
the point you're making is a really good one. What this highlights for us, what he's done is to say, well, if you don't want God, then this is the only thing that makes sense. And if you go, well, I don't like that, where are you then?
Exactly.
Because Nietzsche also takes it out to the conclusion of it, because he wants to get to this Superman kind of view of humanity. And he says, well, once we're there, we're going to be so much more superior than people are today. And if there are any of us left, they should kill us. Like, it would be the right thing to do would be to, you know, massacre the lot of us, because that's necessary for that progression there. And you read that and you go, man, that's really,
the implications are crazy.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, this is interesting because he dies in 1900. So, you know, at the beginning of the 20th century, and his work is enormously popular. It's popular also because it's provocative as well. You know, to be in the early 20th century, to be into Nietzsche, you know, you're a bit edgy and people love this, right?
But do they understand what he's saying? Because I don't know that even if I rejected the Christian worldview, I don't know that I'd want to necessarily own what he's saying, because it does make me look a little bit like a Nazi.
Well, I mean, yes, I guess after the Second World War, perhaps. I mean, look, Nietzsche scholars were quick to point out that Nietzsche, you know, the Nazism not an expression of Nietzscheanism. Now, I mean, I don't think he gets away with clean hands from that. But here's the thing, right? I feel like at the beginning of the 20th century, right, it's almost like through all of this that God is saying, choose this day whom you will serve. Let's polarize this. Stop fooling yourself into thinking I'm a Christian and I sort of wear this badge, and yet I'm still preoccupied with trying to be better than other people, be noticed more, climb the ladder, competition. I mean, this is, This comes, in the sort of height of industrialist society that is all about competition.
Yeah.
And so much of our culture is built around competition, isn't it? And it's not, in some sense, competition can be okay. It can be fun, and there's competition in sports and all of that sort of stuff. But there is a dark side to
and trying to be
competition.
your best self, I think, is
That's right. Yeah, of course.
But
Yeah.
it's what makes best.
Yeah,
What's the measure?
where do I get my identity from?
Yeah.
If it's not from God, then it's in comparison with other people. I'm only going to feel good if I'm better than you. This is what Nietzsche is saying. This is the will to power, right? You've just got this drive within you to measure yourself against each other. And if you don't succeed in that, basically even worse than that is that you just hide in the crowd. Now, in some ways, I agree with Nietzsche there as well, like just hiding in the crowd and just parroting the stuff that everyone parrots and is, equally, for Nietzsche, that's an abdication of choice, right? Because you just go with the flow, right? I don't really make my own choices. I just go with the flow. I think he's right about that. He wants to bring us to a confronting choice. And it's a choice that we avoid because maybe we're just too busy going with the flow or, just we've been, it's just easier. So he wants to say, no, choose. Yeah. You've got to choose. Is it this way or is it that way? And in a funny sort of way, I think the timeliness of this, I almost feel like is prophetic because think about the 20th century and what happens in the 20th century. By the mid-20th century, the world is reeling from this horror at what human beings are capable of. The massacres and you've got the massacres of the First World War, you've got the Holocaust, you've got Stalinism. It was a horrible, in the mid-20th century, of course that was all still underway. But, human beings were horrified by what we have become as people. And I feel like at the beginning of the century, it was almost like in a funny sort of providential way, as horrific as everything that we've looked at today seems, I feel like it was a bit of a warning, right? It was a bit of a polarization moment,
Is it a bit like heaven and hell? Like it's almost like
so,
it's almost like putting a picture up.
Yeah.
This way leads to heaven. This way leads.
Yeah.
This is hell.
It's the two trees. It's a
bit of a parallel
that's right.
there. You choose.
There are key moments throughout the Bible where God polarizes things, Elijah on Mount Carmel, choose, which God, choose one or the other, right? Not a bit of, you can't have both.
A foot in both camps.
Yeah, no foot in both camps, right? And I think what happens at this stage, in the late 19th century and Nietzsche's work really takes root at the beginning of becomes sort of trendy in the early 20th century there's a bit of a warning here. And I think if I can land this, I just don't think we face this choice as clearly. We're very reticent to really face the choices that we are in effect making day to day. It's day to day, right? It's that instinct within us that wants to be
rise up.
Whereas Jesus is saying to us, no, I want you to stoop down and raise up others, not rise up over others, but to stoop down like he did and raise others up.
Again, It's that opposite.
It's the opposite.
Polar opposite.
The teaching of Jesus works directly against, this worldly kind of thinking. The first will be last and the last will be first. And there is heaven at the end of that road. And the other road, there's hell at the end of that road. And I think there's a polarizing picture here that I think is helpful. We need to own. We're always confronted with the two trees. You get up tomorrow morning and I feel like God wants you to make a choice. It's two trees. How are you going to live today? Is it rise up, compete, will to power, autonomy, independence, do it your own way, come up with your own solutions, fight or flight, or you're actually going to walk with me, which is fundamentally going against human nature as it has become, not as it was created, but as it has become. And that is a choice that faces us every day, and we need to be clear about that.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.